and good evening, Professor Mansi, Professor Wilson, and Callie. Group 2 will be presenting to you guys a code conversation on week 5 reading. My name is Ashanti Williams, and I'll be your moderator for the day's coach conversation.
I'm Kiana Ramos.
I'm Reagan Beheimer.
I'm Avery Navarro.
I'm Kristen Castro.
I'm Catherine Rogers.
And I'm Michaela Banker.
The first question for the day's coach conversation will be, in the article, in the country we love, do you think that Diane's parents being deported affected her life?
I would say that'd be like a really bad experience because that those are the people who like raised you and stuff, depending on your relationship with your parents. But for me personally, I think that'd be a hard thing to go through.
I agree. I feel like that'd be really hard to go through, especially because she was only 14. And it's like, I feel like you go through a lot during like your teenage years and like really find out who you are. And if you don't have your parents for that, and if you can't lean on them with like everything that you're going through personally, and they're not in your life to guide you, then I feel like that'd be a really hard thing to go through.
I agree. Like, if like I thought about like losing my parents at such a young age as 14, because 14 is an age where you learn about who you are, what you want to do, like, and you just go through different things like physically, mentally, and like just not having your parents there. I'm like how Reagan said, like depending on the relationship you have with your parents, that's so hard because you'll be like, oh, I want my mom for this thing, but your mom isn't there. Or like, I would do this stuff with my dad, but your dad isn't there. And then in the article it said she lost her parents, not as they died, but it felt like they did because they just weren't there anymore.
Mom had asked her like what she was going to do, and then she responded that she was going to stay in the US. She had to make that decision at such a young age, and that is alone in itself is really hard, because do you want to be with your family in a country that you've never been to, or do you want to be away with your family and stay in the country you know? So that was a big impact on her life.
Yeah, I was just saying that like it breaks that connection because like you need your parents there to like guide you through everything. And then like if they get deported, like what does that do for you, you know?
Yeah, like kind of to expand a bit on like what Kiana said, like even though her parents weren't dead, it just felt like they were, and it's kind of a difficult situation since they can never like, you can't really explain to somebody that feeling unless they like also went through it. And it's not like nobody's mourning with you because obviously your parents are still alive, but it's just the like disconnect of like knowing that they're not there and that you have to go through your whole life without them. And especially like Avery said, like making that decision at such a young age to like stay, and like not only is she like losing her family, but now she has to like navigate the world kind of not completely on her own, because obviously she's going to stay with like family, but like on her own in the sense that like not having your parents there to like rely or to talk about or like to call your mom about a situation, like to grow up really fast so young.
Not only that is traumatizing in itself, but her just having to see her mom like on the other side, you know, of the glass, like talking to her on the phone, like that's just so traumatizing. And then when they had to take her away and she was like, she's not a criminal, like she didn't do nothing wrong. And just like seeing that at a young age, just thinking like, you know, your own parents didn't do anything, but they're behind bars basically for what, wanting a better life and an opportunity. That's just so like traumatizing and scary.
I agree with like what you guys said. Like I felt as though it had a really big impact on her life and the way she had to make certain decisions and what she had to do. And yeah. Our second question for today's coach conversation will be, why do you think it was difficult for Latinos to be identified as one name, and why did it change over the years?
I think it was difficult for them to be like associated with like one word because it's like it was describing like everyone, and like everyone's different, so you can't just group people like into one word. And like I feel like that's what we do as humans. We're always trying to put people in groups, and I feel like that is one of our flaws because like I said, everyone's different. And like it's also hard for them because it's like like their culture. They want to keep their culture alive and everything, but when you're like modernizing it, that it's like you're not keeping the culture alive and like what their like ancestors and stuff did for them, and you're just ruining it. I don't know.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is that it's just difficult to kind of be put into one box, and especially in America, I feel like we have a lot more prominent culture of like these are our boxes and to fit into them. And as like times went on, like obviously we started from like Latino to Hispanic to Latinx. And I personally overarching like use Latinx and identify as that because I feel like it overall encompasses like the LGBT community as well as like our own cultural identities. So I kind of agree with that in that sense, but I know my personal views are very different from like my grandma's personal views. And it's kind of hard to like navigate culture when everything's been built for so long on like the foundation that's kind of been set by everyone. And like our whole lives, personally, like as a Latino, like my whole life has just kind of been set of like not knowing exactly how to identify or like what I am. Like obviously overarching my ethnicity, I know I'm like Hispanic. Like I use all the terms kind of, but like I know that's how I identify like my ethnicity rise. But when it comes to my race, I've never known like what to put in the box because technically I'm Taino native, but also I'm white, but also I'm black, but also like I'm all these things just in a mixing pot. And it's like difficult when it comes to like a sheet of like what race are you? It's like weird to put exactly what I feel or like what I am.
There's just like there's just such a big group and a big variety that you can't really fit into one box. And when I was like reading this article, I was like I was talking to my mom and I'm like, Mommy, like, have you ever heard of Latinx? And she's like, No, I've never heard of that. And I'm like, oh, it's like a different group of like Latinos or Hispanics is like this new thing that's a new like name that's coming up so it fits everyone. But and she's like, oh, like that's so interesting, but they never heard of it. So since it's such a new thing that's coming for like Gen Z, I guess, or millennials that are using it a lot, I saw like in the article there was a really big percentage that now millennials and Gen Z are using Latinx. But like so many people are just I know my family is just set on like their tradition, like they're Latinos or Hispanics. And I totally get what you're saying about like, you know, your ethnicity, but then when it comes to race, you don't know. Cause I'm Puerto Rican and there's just such a mix. Like there's the natives like Tainos, there's just like a big mix. So every time like I talk to other friends, they're like, oh, what did you put? And I'm like, I just identify as white, I guess, as race, but there's just so many things. And I know there was like a lot of controversy because I've been looking up articles. They're like, I just don't even like check off the race box because there's just too much like that they fit in their culture.
Yeah, like you guys said, how you have to like fill in the boxes and like you don't really know what to put down. And in the article, how it states a Dominican friend said that she marks Hispanic/Latino and adds Dominican, but marks other in the race category and is frustrated because she is not allowed to add more. But she would also like to mark herself Black, but they won't understand what that is. And since like, because people do have multiple identities, and if you can't like show people that as simple as marking off your ethnicity on paper, then how like can you express that so people can understand?
This also applies to like the interview, because during the interview, Dr. Rivera was like talking about how she has like students come up to her and they like talk about her culture, or like everyone's culture, and how they say they don't have culture. But it's like, it doesn't really matter like where you grew up. It matters like who you are. And like with the Latinx thing, it's like some people might use that like towards their culture. They might be saying like it's a new thing towards their culture, but it's like also applying to everyone. And she was telling them like, just keep your culture alive, you know, like it's who you are.
Yeah, I feel like if you can like relate to other people's experiences and like share your same experiences in the same culture, like that's what keeps the culture moving into like the generations and like the new generations.
So their question for the day is Coach conversation will be, do you think that other immigrants around the world would want to have other names for their group?
Really depends on like where they live, because some places in the world I feel like are more like younger generations that might be like leading towards naming different groups or like encouraging different groups to be renamed. But then there's like other parts of the world where it's like older generations are pushing towards like keeping their traditions alive and they don't really want to change anything.
I feel like as like time goes on, like the newer generation, we're kind of pushing for more like inclusive terminology, and it's just more of a game of seeing like how like the older like people in our cultures like react, and how like if it actually catches on. And with like the internet and everything, it's like way easier to like tell more people about something to try to get like a movement going, which I feel like whereas like Latinx mainly started was like kind of on the internet, and then it kind of spread more, and then it became more common terminology. So I feel like it's all about like having like open conversations about like becoming more inclusive. Like Latinx is like directly kind of referring to like gender neutral terminology for the LGBTQIA plus community, to see if those conversations kind of open up to other cultures, to see if they kind of want to do the same thing. But it also depends on if people are open to changing the terminology they've always used their entire lives.
Language is constantly evolving, so I think yes, and people just want kind of like a word that they can connect to with their identity. So
I think Latinx is such like a big thing now, because in the Spanish language you have feminine and masculine, which feminine is like Latina, and then if you have like the masculine, it's Latino. You know what I'm saying? So I guess just like setting a name that just fits everyone. I think since now Latinx is just a big thing, other people are gonna start wanting for their own group like their own name. So I think it like can definitely spread.
Yeah, like I agree with that. I feel as though the other immigrant group would want to like have a name that fits like everybody's gender, and like it doesn't specifically apply to like what your race or ethnicity is, but it kind of explains who you are, and if you're able if you use it, you're able to like know who I am or what's not. Our question for today's coach conversation will be, how does where we were raised affect our cultural identity?
So of like the different communities throughout like the world, and like I feel like where you were raised, some places might be like more involved in like their backgrounds and their cultures, while other ones will be more like evolving and trying to get new cultures and new traditions throughout their communities and where they live as well.
Yeah, like I kind of wrote about it a bit, but like in the Dr. Rivera interview, she's like directly says, we're still bringing beautiful things to the community. Bring what you know from where you come from. Everyone has a culture, and like everyone has the right to like bring their own cultures to like whatever environment that they grew up in. Like I kind of connected to the overall conversation during it, because I was also like raised in New York, and like I'm Cuban and Puerto Rican. And my entire life, like I've always been to all like the Cuban Day parades and the Puerto Rican Day parades, and like have been filled with people that like were my culture, and like we just were proud and we're celebrating it. And like there's usually like Puerto Rican food everywhere, and like being raised like around my family. So I was raised with like a lot of like cultural pride. Whereas like when I moved down here to Florida, like all that was kind of gone. Not to say that people don't directly like celebrate their cultures. Like whenever I'm in Miami, I get a like strong sense of like kind of Cuban culture and like Cuban pride. But I feel like especially like now where like I was lived in Naples for a bit, whereas like everyone doesn't really like celebrate what they are directly, and everyone just kind of keeps to themselves, and it's just an overarching thing like we are all the same, but like we lose kind of like our sense of like self. And I feel like our identity is kind of an important part of that. Like in the language and identity article, like one of the quotes from it is, our name, our national origin, and our citizenship constitute very intimate parts of our identity. And I feel like it's very important things that like we should own up to and connect to.
I agree with like bringing in your culture into your community so other people can learn and grow about it and love it as much as you love your own culture. But Also, I think sometimes it's a scary thing. In the interview with Masalo Martinez, he said when he came down here and he would just be talking on the phone, like in Spanish in the supermarket, he would be embarrassed because in his like area, people didn't know about it. And it's just like a scary thing when you move to one place and come to another and, no one really connects to you or your culture, your identity, your language. It's just like a scary thing. And it's happened to me once where I'll be speaking Spanish out with my friends, and this woman came up, and it's your classic case of like, oh, you're in America, speak English, and we're just like, oh, like, so I think it's just like it's scary sometimes, depending on the people you surround yourself with or you're around in general, but just knowing like for my future generations, like when I have a family and when I grow up and have kids, like I want my kids to know, I want my kids to speak Spanish. I want my kids to know of like the different type of music we had of Puerto Rico, or like the different types of dances, I want them to grow up with the same culture I had, that I knew and loved.
Yeah, I did multicultural dancing in high school. So like I did the Hispanic team, and it was definitely different because like I'm just white, so like it definitely, because like they asked the question, they were like, oh, like who's Cuban, who's Spanish, and like everyone's raising their hand, and like I'm just white, so like I wasn't like raising my hand, so it was definitely like scary. But like I definitely learned like a lot of new things like about all the countries and like their dancing and how they do everything. So it's definitely like important to have like that knowledge.
I feel like it would be better if we like had more stuff that represented like everybody's culture and stuff. Like Kristen said, when she moved to Florida, she didn't see like a lot of stuff that represented her culture. But if we had that, like more of that in the community and everything, we would have people who felt more appreciated, as well as like you would learn stuff. Like I would learn stuff I didn't know, or whoever else. But
Yeah, and then in the language and migration article, Professor Martinez talks about being raised in Italy, and then he moves to I think it was Kentucky, I can't remember, and how like his surroundings, like people just couldn't understand how he could be from two different countries, and they would question him and like make up his own identity for him, and that could like really affect someone's cultural identity because like you have other people questioning like yourself.
When he talked about that, I just kind of found that like so crazy. Like it's just like, how can, like he said that people just felt so privileged to tell him that he didn't come from those countries. Like I just find that so crazy. Like how can someone tell you that you're not from there when you're literally from there? Like they don't know your background, they don't know your cultural identity. It's just like, it's so weird. I don't know, I can't grasp it.
Well, people just like they just assume like pretty much based on looks. So it's like, oh, you speak Italian, or yeah, Italian.
You can't like judge people just by their looks, because like you don't know where they came from and like what their cultural backgrounds are.
I think overall, with everything we've said so far, the main topics that were touched on was just the importance of like identifying with our own cultural identities and to be open to new progression as like new terminology comes out, but while also having understanding of the older generations like concept of it, and that other cultures may also like start to adapt to coming up with new terminology, as well as the importance of like where you're raised and how it affects your cultural values and how strong connected you feel to it or disconnected you feel to it, and that can carry you on. And that the very first topic we talked about was also like how immigration would affect how like we feel would affect like us personally, as well as like what Diane went through in her story. And so everything was just kind of tied down to putting ourselves in somebody else's shoes, and also like evaluating our own cultures and seeing how that affects us in the end, and how it creates like our own personal identities and like how we celebrate them.